Hey everyone, my name is Kiera Edwards, and I am the founder of Unique Families Journey. Our mission is to educate, empower families and children with special needs. Today, we have our friend Kevin Daly, who is under the Unique Families Journey, and he will be discussing laws that protects students with disabilities. Before we begin, Kevin, you want to introduce yourself to everyone?
Thanks for having me on again, Kiara. I just wanted to say I've been working with families for a long time, going to 504 meetings, PPT meetings. You're about to see a video that kind of puts things into perspective. So, without further ado, let's watch it. Oh, by the way, if you have any questions or comments, please put them in the chat so that we can see them. Thank you. If you attended public school in the 1960s, like I did, you never saw a kid with a disability in your classroom. Kids with physical disabilities and kids with intellectual disabilities were walled off from the other students. They were segregated into different schools and private institutions. Some of them didn't go to school at all. Kids with hidden disabilities like ADHD, dyslexia, and emotional disorders, the kind you can't tell just by looking, they were present in the classroom along with the other students too. But back in the bad old days, students with hidden disabilities were usually regarded as lazy or problem students, or simply out to lunch. These days, public school is very different for students with disabilities. It's routine to see students with wheelchairs in classrooms with their peers. Students with hidden disabilities and intellectual disabilities have a better experience too. Schools are required to identify these students and provide an appropriate education that matches their abilities. So what happened? How did we get there? What made public schools become a better place for students with disabilities? This video is about how that happened. It's important to note that I am not an attorney, and this video is not legal advice. If you ask me, it's federal legislation that was enacted in the 1970s that made public schools a better place for students with disabilities. This video is about these laws. Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act and the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. It's about the rights these laws give public school students with disabilities and the obligations that public schools must live up to. Section 504 goes back to 1973. It's part of the Rehabilitation Act, signed into law by President Richard M. Nixon. The Rehabilitation Act of 1973 is a civil rights legislation from the golden era of civil rights. This law, over 1,000 pages long, is intended to remove barriers to people with disability of all ages and allow equal access to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act gives rights to students with disabilities, specifically students who have physical or mental impairments which substantially limit one or more major life activities. Typically, these rights translate into accommodations in the general education setting. Accommodations like extended time on tests and projects, teachers providing study guides to prepare for exams, classrooms that are accessible to students who use wheelchairs and other equipment. Public schools must provide these students with a free and appropriate public education, or FAPE as it's called, by providing accommodations that allow these students to attend school with their typical peers whenever possible. The accommodations a student receives under Section 504 are written up in a document called a 504 plan. The 504 plan is communicated to the teachers and staff who work with the student. The accommodations in a student's 504 plan are determined by their 504 team. This team is typically composed of teachers, school staff, parents, or guardians. The team must meet at least once a year in order to update the plan. The 504 team is also responsible for determining if a student is eligible for 504 accommodations. Eligibility is based on how a student's disability impacts their educational performance. I mean performance on tests, quizzes, report cards, evaluations, and the ability to follow classroom routines and school activities. Not every student who has a disability is eligible for 504 accommodations. Their disability must have a negative impact on their performance in school in order to be eligible. When necessary, a 504 team can conduct evaluations to determine how a disability affects a student's performance, although sometimes the impact is so obvious that an evaluation isn't necessary. It's interesting to note, Section 504 is an unfunded mandate from Washington. It provides no funding to public schools to help them meet their obligations. Unfunded mandates aren't very popular with public administrators. They prefer mandates that come with funding. Section 504 is enforced by the U.S. Office of Civil Rights, which makes sense because it's civil rights legislation. The Boston office of OCR is responsible for Connecticut students. The other law I want to talk about is IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. IDEA was enacted in 1978, 5 years after Section 504. Here you see President Carter signing it into law. Unlike Section 504, IDEA is a funded mandate. It provides federal funding to public school districts for providing special education and related services to students who are eligible. Like Section 504, IDEA is for students who have a physical or mental impairment that has a negative impact on their performance in school. To be eligible for IDEA, a student must also require individualized instruction in order to succeed. This is where Section 504 and IDEA differ. More about that in a moment. Like Section 504, public schools are required to provide a free and appropriate public education, or FAPE, to students who are eligible for services under IDEA. Unlike Section 504, IDEA also requires public schools to educate eligible students in the least restrictive environment, also known as LRE. This is where you find typical peers in the general education environment. You won't find the words least restrictive environment anywhere in Section 504, but I believe a student's 504 plan, if it's worth its salt, should pretty much guarantee the student has access to the least restrictive environment. Like Section 504, IDEA requires a team that determines a student's eligibility and services. Here in Connecticut, we call it a PPT team. PPT stands for Planning and Placement Team. Like Section 504, the team is composed of teachers, school staff, and the student's parents or guardians. Like Section 504, students who are eligible for services under IDEA have a written plan. It's called an Individualized Education Program, or IEP. After eligibility is determined, the PPT team meets at least once a year to update the student's IEP. About individualized instruction. The need for individualized instruction is what makes students with disabilities eligible for an IEP instead of a 504 plan. Examples of individualized instruction include special education itself, or a specialized reading program, or a specialized math program, a social skills program, even a behavior management program. The need for individualized instruction is assessed through evaluations, report cards, and a student's day-to-day performance in school. If a student is found eligible for an IEP, they are reassessed every 3 years. Like a 504 plan, the student's IEP states all the accommodations that are necessary for the student to have equal access to the benefits of education. Unlike a 504 plan, the IEP also has annual goals and objectives that are used to track a student's progress in their special education program. It also states any program modifications that might be necessary. In our state, IDEA is enforced by the Connecticut Department of Education's Bureau of Special Education. On the Bureau's website, you can learn much more about special education and Section 504. Just use this link. You might want to pause the video at this point so you can write it down. When does a Section 504 plan end? Typically, a student's Section 504 plan ends when it's no longer needed, like the student who once had a broken leg, but now it's healed, or when they graduate from high school, whatever comes first. A student who is eligible for a 504 plan in school may still be eligible for 504 accommodations later in higher education and in employment. It's definitely worth looking into when the time comes. When does special education end? A student's IEP can end when they don't need it anymore, like the student who learned to read through special education and now reads on grade level or better. Typically, students who no longer need an IEP are still eligible for a 504 plan. Ultimately, a student's IEP ends when they are issued a high school diploma. Special education can continue until age 22 if it's appropriate, and if a diploma is not issued after high school. As I said earlier, 504 and IDEA revolutionized public education for students with disabilities. Together, they helped thousands of students get off to a productive life. One final note. This video describes the way things should be, but things don't always work the way they should. That's why it's important for parents to understand these laws and what they provide. Thanks for watching.
Wow, Kevin, that was an amazing presentation. Thank you so much for sharing with us. I would like to learn more at a later time. But before we go, I do have a question. Are there any other laws that parents should know about?
Yes, there are quite a few laws that parents of children with disabilities should know about. I think one of the most powerful laws is a state statute that allows parents of public school students to get a free copy of their child's school records. And if you have a child with a 504 plan or an IEP, those records are also included in that. Reviewing your child's records is important. It's an important way to prepare for going to a 504 meeting or a PPT meeting. And in my next video, we're going to be looking at ways for parents to prepare for these meetings and how to do their homework before these meetings. In many ways, the homework that you do to prepare for school meetings is just as important as the meeting itself. So stay tuned.
Wow, thank you. Well, that's it for today, guys. Thank you guys so much for um watching the video with us. Again, if you do have any questions, please leave them in the chat and we will reach back out to you. Or if you want to know more information, send us a DM or a comment and we will get back to you. Have a good day, everyone.